This is why peace, justice, and democracy depend on ethnic studies. I'm Ezra Neeson, and I'm a certified instructor. My complete title is Certified Flight Instructor, which means I have the same background in education as every other certified instructor in America. I just trained to apply it to a different situation. Instead of training to teach classes of 25 or 30 students for a year, I trained to teach individual students how to think objectively in life or death situations. There are a lot of other teachers in my family, and we've been talking about things going wrong with the education system for generations. Being a flight instructor doesn't make me an expert on ethnic studies, but human psychology is the foundation of culture. You learn a lot about psychology, first in flight training and then in instructor certification. After I finished my instructor training, I went looking around to see what else I could find out about psychology. It didn't take me long to find out about a group of scientists called the Club of Budapest. They were scientists from both sides of the Cold War who started meeting in secret in 1987 to try to start what they hoped would be the peace movement equivalent of the Manhattan Project. They were trying to figure out how human psychology created different cultures, ethnicities, religions, and nationalities. Lots of other scientists have been working on that basic project too. By this point, it's essentially finished. All that's left is to get people to learn about it. Now here in Arizona, our governor has just banned ethnic studies classes in our education system, saying they're politically subversive because they blame everything on the white people. Well, let me tell you something about flight training. Lesson number 1 in aviation psychology is that you don't have the luxury of believing in things that aren't real. If you want to fly safely, you have to know how to get the facts you need, and you have to do whatever it takes to move things around in your brain until you understand what the facts mean. Pilot error is by far the leading cause of aviation accidents and fatalities. One of my Native American cousins helped set up the Euro charter school in California and taught the humanities classes there. One real problem with ethnic studies is that there are only so many hours in a day, so there are only so many things you can teach students. The Euro-centric version of history that every ethnic studies class conflicts with does have the justification that it was the Europeans who conquered the world. World history turned out the way it did because of decisions made by Europeans. So, what are you going to teach about everyone else? If you take up class time teaching students about people who made decisions that didn't affect world history, you'll have to sacrifice teaching them about something else. But if you don't teach students anything about the other people, you create the illusion that everyone else was just hanging out waiting for the Europeans to come conquer them. And that supports a lot of racist ideas that white people in the US have had from the very beginning. That's the point of evolutionary psychology. This is an approach to psychology that builds up from human biology. So that makes it the psychological foundation of every culture. This makes ethnic studies a lot simpler because it connects a lot of ideas together within each culture and among cultures. Evolutionary psychology is a science, but for most people it's easier to talk about as a philosophy, because to most people it sounds like a philosophy. Really, any science is only science to the people who can do the experiments. To everyone else, it's just a bunch of ideas that fit together, meaning a philosophy. So I can talk about it as a philosophy here, but just remember, this is the kind of philosophy that secular governments are founded on, and that can be taught in public schools. If you want to follow evolutionary psychology all the way down to biochemistry, you can find out how that works in a book called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. Dr. Dawkins is a zoologist, so he shows how it works among animals, and that's not what I'm here to talk about. Basically, People had known about the survival instinct for ages, and Dr. Dawkins figured out how it worked all the way down to chemistry. All animal behavior maximizes the survival rate of the genes that cause the behavior, whether that gene is part of that animal or part of another animal. That's kind of a complicated way of talking about animal behavior because there are a lot of complicated ways that happens. A simple way it happens is the way a lot of animals trick their predators with camouflage. If a species of bird preys on a species of insect, one way for the insect to keep from getting eaten would be to fly faster than the bird so the bird couldn't catch it. But another way for the insect to stay away from the bird would be for the insect to look like a few blades of grass stuck together. If the insect tricks the bird into thinking it's some grass, the bird will fly away, so it still won't catch the insect. The genes that made the bird fly away weren't the bird's genes, they were the insect's genes. Evolutionary psychology is this applied to people. Now we can say that all human behavior is the product of the attempt by the individual to maximize the survival rate of his or her genes by the most effective means perceivable to him or her. Again, that's a pretty complicated way of saying it because there's a lot of complicated ways that works. A very thorough introduction to evolutionary psychology is called How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker. An easier way to think of it is, everyone always makes the best decisions they can think of in their situation, and everyone's idea of the best decisions always means whatever they believe to be the most effective way of keeping their genes alive, but people can make mistakes, which includes misinterpreting their situation or being tricked by other people. Now, to make it even easier, we can say that all human behavior is motivated by self-preservation. We just have to add that self-preservation doesn't refer to the person's own body. It refers to whatever the individual person considers to be a part of their self, whether consciously or subconsciously. Some people sacrifice themselves for their families, or their friends, or their neighbors, or total strangers, or their countries, or their religions, or for political causes, or whatever. The point is, if you sacrifice anything you have, which includes sacrificing your life, you make the sacrifice for whatever you believe at the time is worth making the sacrifice for. Someone else might have tricked you into believing something was worth making the sacrifice for, and you wouldn't have made the sacrifice if you'd known better. The point is, you don't sacrifice your life for someone you picked out of the phone book at random. Nobody does that. Now, an even easier way to talk about self-preservation is to say that people all over the world have the same body structure, and they have brains to make their bodies work. So people all over the world have the same brain structure too. This doesn't just mean your brain knows how to make your arms and legs and fingers and toes move. It also knows how to do more complicated things that keep you alive in the long run. That means all those self-preservation things. Like starting to look for food long before you starve to death, which is what you do when you start to get hungry. And trying to hook up with people of the opposite gender, which not everyone does, but most people do. A lot of people consider having children to be an important way of defining their self. Other people have other ways of defining their self, so they decide not to have children for various reasons. The selfish gene theory and evolutionary psychology are two gigantic discoveries. These are what scientists call first principles. A first principle is a law that has proven to be universal. The selfish gene theory connected chemistry to biology, and evolutionary psychology connected biology to psychology. So now we can say that self-preservation is every bit as much an inescapable law as the law of gravity. You wouldn't vote for a politician who said she was going to make the law of gravity optional. Like if Jan Brewer ran for re-election saying, "We're going to inspire a lot of creativity that will stimulate the Arizona economy by getting rid of all the building codes and aircraft design regulations. And from now on, we'll let architects and airplane engineers decide for themselves whether or not the law of gravity applies to them." You wouldn't vote for her if she said that. You'd say she was insane. Well, in the same way, self-preservation is an inescapable law. As long as there are people in the world, people will always plan their lives around self-preservation. For that matter, as long as there are bacteria in the world, self-preservation will be an inescapable law. A tree grows toward the sunlight because that's how a living thing uses its body to get the things it needs in life. And isn't that what illegal immigration is, too? Living things using their bodies to try to get what they need in life? That's how every human decision is made. That includes people like the Minutemen who go down to the border to guard it themselves. We can argue and argue about who's right and who's wrong, but that's not going to get us very far because everyone always believes their own side is right. The real question we should be asking is, who has a plan that's actually going to work? There's one more important discovery that's fundamental to evolutionary psychology. 100,000 years ago, everyone's ancestors were brown, because they all lived in Africa, where they needed a lot more skin pigment to protect them from the sun. So not only do we all have the same brain structure to keep track of our universal body structure, our universal brain structure also carries a sort of memory of the same living conditions. A simple example of that is the kind of landscaping people pick when they have a choice. You know how people's lawns, city parks, and golf courses all have the same pattern of a lot of grass, a few trees, and, if people can afford it, some water? Well, if you went to the plains of Africa and dug down to the level of soil sediments where the fossils of the first human bones were found, guess what kind of seeds you'd find there? Seeds for a lot of grass and a few trees. Of course, there had to be running water there because people need fresh water to live. So this means that Jan Brewer's front lawn, and the lawn in front of the state capitol where she works, and the city park across the street from the state capitol, and every other lawn, park, and golf course in the world, is a replica people have made of the plains of Africa from 100,000 years ago. Now this brings me to some much bigger patterns that people all over the world have in common. Once you recognize that our brains keep track of what our bodies are doing, that means our brains are only capable of thinking about things our bodies are capable of doing. People all over the world have invented a lot of things. People in different parts of the world have invented things using whatever technological level they have and whatever materials they have to work with. Some people build computers and space shuttles and nuclear reactors. Some people make all their clothes out of grass and animal hides and make all their tools out of stone and wood and bone. But one way or another, everything people invent is an extension of something you can do with your body. A stone hammer is a way of hitting things harder than you can hit them with your fist, and so is a jackhammer. A pair of sandals is a way of increasing your ability to travel, and so is a space shuttle. A painting on a cave wall is a way of keeping track of information, and so is a computer. Face paint is a way of changing the way you look, and so is cosmetic surgery. It doesn't matter how much stuff you invent, nobody can get out of this pattern because nobody's brains can figure out how.